So today I've chosen 3 short readings from the Synoptic Gospels that address the Last Supper. And it's interesting that scholars believe that Mark's was the first gospel written about 70 AD, and then Matthew about 80 AD and Luke about 90 AD, and that Matthew and Luke borrowed very extensively from Mark's gospel. So you can see the similarities in all 3 and some subtle differences in their accounts of the Last Supper. From Mark chapter 14. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Matthew's account, which is almost identical, except he adds the phrase, for the forgiveness of sins. He inserts that into the tract. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Luke's account, when the hour came, Jesus and his disciples reclined at table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds its fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you, for I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." So if you notice, Luke mentions the cup twice. In actual fact, at the Seder meal, the cup is drunk 4 times, and there's a 5th cup set out for Elijah. So it's interesting that Luke is the only non-Jew who writes the scriptures, and he's the person who gets the Seder meal correct. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, it's my custom each month to take a theme for the month and then develop the theme over the first 2 Sundays. And then on the 3rd Sunday, typically I do a recap of the 2 and then open it up to a Q&A. But this is a 5th Sunday. So on the 5th Sunday, I do what I call a one and done. It's a term from college basketball. So today I'm going to look at the Last Supper and talk about that a little bit. So to introduce it somehow, for me, one of the most fascinating features of the near-death experience is that there's a timelessness associated with it, that everything is in the eternal now. The past, the present, and the future. So there's a timelessness that these people, these NDERs, talk about. That there isn't a past, present, and future, but that everything is present to them at the moment. Particularly when they do the life review, it's like everything is there, and some future events, because they're going to come back, are also presented. So today, then, I want to use the notion of timelessness as a springboard for imagination. And I've said to you many, many times that there's a huge difference between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is making up stuff that's not real. Imagination, I believe, is the ability to volitionally shift your state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, interact with energies and entities that reside in those other dimensions, learn from them, and then come back into this dimension and cross-fertilize what you've learned there with what you know here. So today, then, I want to use this notion of timelessness and imagination to visit the Last Supper. And I'm going to make three main points. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the notion of time. And then I'm going to talk about non-local consciousness. And then finally, I want to have a look at the Last Supper. So time, how real is time? And how real are the events that happen in time? So take the Last Supper, for instance. What really happened? How many people were present? What conversations took place? And what did Jesus really do and say? Now, I believe that time only exists in some dimensions of the cosmos. We live in a cosmos and a metaverse in which there are many, many, many different dimensions. And we just happen to live in a dimension where, because of the small size of our little piece of wetware that we carry between our ears, we can't grok the gestalt. And so we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces, and process them chronologically, thus giving rise to the illusion of time. But we need it in this dimension. But I do not believe that time exists in many dimensions of the cosmos. And when time does exist, I believe that it is merely a framework of opportunities, a kind of a scaffolding of possibilities. It is not that there's one concrete singular record that exhausts all the parameters, and that there was only one version of history or one version of an event, and that exhausted all the possibilities. I don't believe that for a moment. Time is really an illusion that we kind of force it into these parameters. And for me, then, the greatest test of the reality of time is to ask the question, is this interpretation transformative or not? Many times I've defined for you the difference between truth and fact. Something could be true, but not factual, and something could be factual and not true. And so my definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God, and something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. And so given that definition of truth, then I want to ask, examine time from that construct. So what if several versions of the past are transformative, while the allegedly historical version is just blah and dull and uninspiring? What if we're like cockroaches, using quantum mechanics to observe a spiral galaxy, that we're that kind of limited? So which version of history are you going to kind of align with? The allegedly kind of historical version, or the versions which are transformative, and create a connection to source for you? So time, in fact, is just an artifact of this particular dimension of consciousness. And as I say, it's merely a scaffolding, a skeleton around which we build real experiences. So I did look then at, and allied to that, the notion of non-local consciousness. The root of today's quantum revolution was an Irish physicist, a guy called John Stuart Bell, who came up with possibly the second most important, formula of the 20th century. It's called Bell's theorem. It shows that quantum mechanics really permits instantaneous connections between far apart locations, that there's an entanglement that goes on at every level of the cosmos. Now, this notion, when it came up first, Einstein spoke about it as spooky action at a distance. He didn't believe in it. And he posited that there must be some hidden variable that's accounting for this alleged, instantaneous connection between locations which are far apart. But in 1964, John Bell proved mathematically that there is not a hidden variable in it. And so using math, he figured out, what the score was. And then in 1981, a French physicist called Alain Aspect proved it experimentally, in his laboratories using entangled photons. And since then, it's been replicated again and again and again and again. And it's the basis for our computer technology right now. So non-local consciousness is a kind of a field phenomenon. It's like a magnetic field. So if you take, for instance, a bunch of iron filings and put them on a steel plate and hold a magnet underneath it, the magnet underneath it will totally reorganize all the filings, on the sheet. And so it involves everything, because everything on the iron pad is in a field, a magnetic field created by the magnet itself. So non-local consciousness is like that. It's a field which affects everything in the field. Now, I think the same thing is true of parallel lifetimes. I believe that we're actually living instantaneously in many different lifetimes, and that we're cross-fertilizing these on a regular basis. But in each particular version, we're identified with an ego that thinks this is the only version of life that I'm living right now. I'm sure many of you find the same thing, that in your dreams, there's a kind of a cross-fertilization of parallel lifetimes that are informing your dreams. So as you dream, you're learning from many very different parallel lifetimes that you're currently living. Now, I'm going to give you some simple and beautiful examples, of this. Two examples from nature that I came across very recently in a book I was reading is if you take a hive of bees, the queen bee plugs the entire colony into what I would call a species-specific consciousness that guides all of the tasks of all of the members. So the queen bee is like this extraordinary receptor who's taking in a species-specific consciousness and radiating it out to all the members of the colony. Now, if you remove the queen from the hive and take her even a few miles away, she's still mediating an influence that guides the behavior, and she's doing it from a distance. But if you kill the queen bee, all of the activities of the hive instantly cease. So the connection to the species-specific consciousness has been severed. But as long as she's alive, she's radiating this information like a computer, like a quantum computer, to all of the members, guiding them in their disparate tasks. It's not like they're all doing the same thing. She's radiating information which allows every single member to go about their tasks. Second example from nature. If you've ever watched a bunch of starlings in synchronized flying, it's called murmurations, where you get this huge big group, thousands of starlings, flying as a unit, and they're twisting and turning and swooping and swirling in this kind of shape-shifting clouds. So for me, it's the same thing, is that there's some colony-specific entanglement in the group consciousness that coordinates all of the actions of all of the members until it's time to break formation, and then each individual has to land in a different roosting spot. But for the period of the murmuration, as they're swimming, there's this colony-specific entanglement. There's only one mind that's guiding the flight of every single individual member. But it's not just confined to kind of bees and birds. There's an example, at the core of yourself, from your very humanity. DNA is an individual-specific receiver for non-local consciousness that's coordinating and connecting you throughout time, and is constantly coordinating your sense of self, even though your physical body is changing. You're going to lose 500,000 cells every single second, but you still retain a sense of self. And so it's possible, that this is being orchestrated by your DNA. It's specific to you. So it's an individual-specific receptor for non-local consciousness that guides your trajectory throughout this entire incarnation. So in actual fact, this may be part of, I'm going to call it the meta task of what allegedly is junk DNA. That the meta task of this junk DNA is about retaining your sense of self, and retaining your sense of self, even though there's an ongoing change in your body. It's an ongoing restoration of your unique body that allows you to think, this is me. Whether you're looking at yourself at 77, as I am, or as a 7-year-old boy, or a 15-year-old teenager, it's the same sense of self being mediated by the receptor that's in contact with this non-local consciousness. And certainly there are examples from the near-death experience. People who report near-death experiences immediately have access to timelessness, the entire span of past, present, and future of this current incarnation is revealed to them because they're plugged into this non-local consciousness. And also they have enhanced senses. The experience of mystical states affects even the sensorium. The colors are different, the music is different, the feelings are different for people undergoing this. So I came up with a kind of a taxonomy a few nights ago, where I believe that non-local consciousness operates at different levels using specific receptors for each level. So I'm going to go through them in ascending order of importance. I think there are, I'm going to call them organ-specific receptors. So there's a specific receptor that teaches your heart how to be a heart. There's another different organ-specific receptor that teaches your liver how to be a liver. And so, these organ-specific receptors are operating throughout your entire life, and they're delivering information and data to each organ in order to allow it to be what it's meant to be and to live as it's meant to live. So that's the first level, most basic perhaps. And then the next level up would be, I'm going to call it organism-specific receptors. And I just gave you an example of that. DNA is an organism-specific receptor. The organism being you, the human person, and it's specific to you. And it's receiving information and data that allows you to be uniquely yourself, even in the presence of a body that's changing radically over time. So that would be an organism-specific receptor. The next level up for me would be, I'm going to call it a colony-specific receptor. And I give you two examples, a colony of bees or a colony of birds, so that there's specific receptors that allow them to operate as a unit and as a colony. That's the next level. The fourth level I'm going to call species-specific receptors. So, for instance, the human genome, what we have in common as a human species, that there are specific receptors which are species-specific that differentiate humans from other life forms. The next level up I'm going to call planet-specific receptors. And these are, these are receptors plugged in to non-local consciousness that, for instance, allow the laws of planetary motion, that guide the laws of planetary motion, or the magnetosphere that surrounds planet Earth and protects us from solar radiation. I would call those planet-specific receptors. The next level I'm going to call solar system-specific receptors. So like sunspots, or the heliosphere, this envelope, that the sun influences, which extends even way out beyond Pluto. So it's like this balloon, surrounding the solar system that affects all the planets within the system. The next level, the second last level, I'm going to call galaxy-specific receptors. And so these are receptors that are receiving information that's guiding the entire course of the evolution of a particular galaxy. So we know, for instance, that our solar system, which is circumambulating, a black hole at the center of the Milky Way galaxy, that we're not circumambulating it, on a plane or just as a circle that is undulating constantly through different regions, of that plane, like horses on a carousel. When you go you sit in these horses and they're bouncing up and down even as it's going around in circles. And so, in some senses, depending on where in the galaxy we are, as a solar system, we're subject to different kind of information data coming from the galaxy-specific receptors. And then finally, I'm going to call it cosmos-specific receptors. And these are kind of the receptors that are clued into non-local consciousness and allow it to kind of get information, for instance, about the strong force, the weak force, gravity, and electromagnetism. So that's by way of preparation then for a discussion of the Last Supper. I wanted to show that timelessness, is really a feature of many dimensions. I showed you what information is, and I showed you what non-local consciousness is capable of. So I want to now apply that kind of thinking, that kind of model to the Last Supper and unpack it in my own unique fashion. So it's interesting to me that the four gospel accounts, when they talk about, the Last Supper of Jesus, the synoptics are almost identical. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are almost identical. Each of them devotes about a half a chapter of their gospels to the Last Supper. And of that, half chapter, a lot of it is dedicated to the institution of the Eucharist. You go to John's gospel, John has 5 chapters dedicated to the Last Supper, and he never once mentions the Eucharist. He spends the entire, 5 chapters, Jesus giving kind of a mystical synopsis of his teaching, and then responding to really dumb questions from the disciples. But there's not a single mention, in the Last Supper of Eucharist. You're going to have to go elsewhere in John's gospel, like John chapter 6 and John chapter 21, to find evidence of the Last Supper. Now, so that's the kind of the gospel accounts of it that we were brought up in. Now, I have my own memory of the Last Supper. So here's a version of the Last Supper that I personally had on October the 1st this year. And again, I want to emphasize that I'm differentiating between fantasy, which is making up stuff that's not real, and imagination, which is accessing dimensions in which time does not exist. So on October the 1st, I had a raging fever because I had COVID at the time. And as happened to me many, many times in Kenya with malaria, every time I got a fever, I had mystical experiences. So here's one on October the 1st. I found myself present at the Last Supper, totally outside of time. There were over 40 people present, including men, women, and children. And it was a real rowdy affair. Not everybody was even paying attention to Jesus. And I found myself there as a 9-year-old boy with my mother, who was my great-grandmother in this lifetime as Sean. And in that timelessness, she and Jesus' mother were friends. And so from age 6, I would hide behind her skirts as she followed this amazing teacher called Jesus. And sometimes he teased me for my shyness, but always I felt this overpowering love. And so now I find myself at the Last Supper, paying more attention to what he was doing than many of the adults present. And specifically, when he got to the Seder prayers over the bread and the wine, I was immediately aware of the changes that he made to the text. He said, "This is my body, which will be given for you. And this is the cup of my blood, which will be poured out for you." And it seems to me that almost nobody else in the room really got what he was implying, except, of course, his highly intuitive mother and the Magdalene. And child though I was, I really got it, and I was startled. And within 3 days, everybody else fully understood why he changed the text and what he meant by the changes he introduced. Now, personally, in many subsequent lifetimes, as a priest, I've recovered about 11 previous incarnations, just snippets from the individual incarnations. I've been a priest in many of these lifetimes, and I've built my spirituality around these words and around this mystical teaching. And in my 52 years as a priest in this incarnation, each liturgy is a mystical experience for me. And so in 1997, I finally wrote a version called the Eucharistic Prayer of the Cosmos, which we'll use today during the Mass, to try to capture what I heard him say 2,000 years ago. So the question then is my memory, of that night, is it faulty? Because it has certainly been transformative. So I want to end then with talking about your memory of the Last Supper. Do you have a version of the Last Supper that transforms you? Do you think that in a different dimension, you may have been present, in a different timeline, you were present? And how would you know? I invite you this week to think and to meditate on, what do you remember for being present at the Last Supper? Namaste, my brothers and sisters.